Nearly every traveler in Khaz Modan has crossed the marshes of the north, yet few could tell you anything about them afterward. They pass through it on their way to somewhere else, to the dwarven halls in the south, to the highlands in the north, to the wide gray sea in the west, and they carry away only an impression: cold water and coldest sky, mud that pulls at the boot, mist that hides the road a dozen paces ahead. They call it dreary, they call it empty, and they are wrong, though it is an easy mistake to make. For the wetlands hides its importance the way it hides its own horizon, behind a curtain of rain. Here is the thing they overlook: every power that ever held the south of these lands needed this marsh, and not one of them ever truly wanted it. It raised no great cities of its own. It gave no kings to history, no famous wonders, no songs worth singing beside a warm hearth. Its worth was never in itself. Its worth was in what crossed it: the trade and the armies, the fleeing and the trapped, all of them moving through its waters toward some better place. The wetlands was a road wearing the shape of a country, and a road, unlike a fortress, can never be won and then forgotten. It must be kept open every day against a land that is always quietly trying to close it. So I would ask you to sit a while with a question that troubled me for years after my boots had finally dried. What is a place worth when its only value is the ability to leave it? When survival depends not on holding the ground, but on keeping a road across it that no one can afford to lose? I am called Aldrich, Keeper Aldrich, to those who care for such titles. In my younger years I studied among the Kirin Tor in Dalaran, and later spent the better part of my life walking with the Explorers League, prying old truths out of older stones. The wetlands I came to know not from a chart, but from the soles of my feet, and the longer I knew it, the less I believed it was empty at all. Look first at the shape of the place, because the shape explains everything that happened there. The wetlands is a low, drowned bowl, bounded on three sides by mountains and open only to the west, where the land surrenders to the sea. It is the northernmost reach of Khaz Modan, the last dwarven ground before the channel that separates the southern continent from Lordaeron. Picture a chamber with the mountains for walls. Now picture the doors. There are only a few of them, and each one is a story that the marsh has been telling for a very long time. In the south stands the gate of Dun Algaz, a tunneled pass driven through the mountains between Loch Modan and the marsh. To reach it from the wetland side, you must climb a stair of 1,000 stone steps carved into the living rock, rising out of the wet toward the high, cold throat of the pass. It is older than most of the quarrels fought over it, older even than the great sundering of the dwarven people, and for long stretches of history it served as a wall more than a doorway. So long as Dun Algaz held, the lands behind it lay safe. Loch Modan, sheltered by that gate, was reckoned among the most peaceful places in all the eastern continents, and the dwarves who fished its waters and mined its hills could go about their work scarcely troubled by the wars that scoured the world beyond. That is the quiet truth of a barrier. It is only the other face of a road. The same pass that keeps an enemy out lets a friend through, and whoever controls it decides which of those two things it shall be. This is why, when the renegade orcs of the Dragonmaw clan came down into Dun Algaz in later years, the danger was not that they meant to conquer the marsh. No one ever wanted the marsh. The danger was that they would seal the door, that they would cut Loch Modan off from the coast and strand the dwarven homelands away from the sea. A people can lose a battle and endure. What they cannot easily survive is the closing of the only road that carries grain and word and reinforcement and hope. To hold Dun Algaz was never about the stone of Dun Algaz. It was about everything that stone allowed to keep moving. In the north, the marsh offers a second door, and it is the most remarkable thing the dwarves ever built in that whole gray country. The Thandol Span is a set of colossal stone bridges thrown across the deep channel that divides Khaz Modan from the Arathi highlands of southern Lordaeron, the only land path between the two. It was reckoned among the very greatest works of dwarven engineering, vast enough to bear the weight of marching armies, and it was raised for a reason that runs against everything the cynical believe about that race of warriors and smiths. It was built for friendship. After the terrible civil war that shattered the dwarven people into 3 clans, the dwarves of Ironforge wished to keep faith with their estranged kin to the north, and so they spanned the impossible gap with stone that trade and travel and trust might flow between sundered cousins once more. The chronicles describe it as both an economic bridge and a symbolic one, and prosperity followed for both kingdoms as goods and goodwill passed back and forth across the water. It is in that second word, symbolic, that the deeper purpose shows itself, for a people does not raise the greatest work it has ever attempted merely to move cargo a little faster. We can reasonably read the span as an argument made in granite, an argument that the way to heal a broken people is to refuse to let the distance between them harden into a border. For generations the great families of Ironforge kept watch over it, and a thing guarded that long is a thing believed in. And there, in the west, is the last door of all, and the only one that opens onto the wider world. On a small island just off the marsh's drowned coast stands a port the dwarves and their human allies raised and named with deliberate honor, after a king of Lordaeron, Tyrannus Menethil II. Menethil Harbor. From its quays a vessel could carry you across the sea to Theramore upon the far continent of Kalimdor, and an icebreaker could bear you north through frozen waters to the bleak shores of the howling fjord. The Alliance built it at the close of the Third War to be precisely what its position made it, the sea link binding the dwarven south to the kingdoms of its allies. 3 doors of land and water then, and a 4th threshold rising in the east toward a mountain we shall come to in time. Hold that picture in your mind, a bowl of gray water with the mountains for walls and a handful of guarded doors. The whole long history of the Wetlands is the history of who held those doors and what it cost to keep even one of them open. Return now to the bridge in the north, for the Thandol Span teaches the deepest lesson the marsh has to offer, and it teaches it twice. The first lesson is what a road can build. The second is what happens when someone decides to break it. Consider what the span meant in its better days. 2 great arches of stone. Some old accounts insist there were 3 before time, and war took their toll, striding across a gulf that nature plainly never intended anyone to cross. The dwarves who raised it were not bridging a stream. They were bridging a wound, the very wound their own civil war had opened, and the prosperity that flowed across it afterward was, in its way, a kind of forgiveness rendered into commerce. For at least 3 generations, one of the old dwarven houses stood guard over it, and that detail tells you how a road must be loved if it is to survive. A wall, once built, mostly takes care of itself. A bridge that joins two peoples must be defended in every generation by people who may never fully remember why their grandfathers thought the joining worth the cost. Now consider what it meant when the road became a target. In the Great War against the Orcish horde, the leaders of the alliance understood at once that the enemy must come through the span, for there was no other land path by which an army could move between the continents. The bridge that had been built to carry friendship was suddenly the throat through which an invasion would either pour or be stopped. And in the end, it was at the Thandol Span and the lands around it that the tide was turned, when the great commander Anduin Lothar drove the broken horde back south across the bridge and into Khaz Modan. The same stones that had carried grain in peacetime carried the fate of nations in war. That is the strange double life of any road. In quiet years, it is the most generous thing a people can make. In bitter ones, it becomes the thing most worth killing for. Just south of the bridge sat the town of Dunmodar, a stout dwarven settlement whose entire importance lay in its position upon that road. It changed hands again and again across the wars, and each time it changed hands, the meaning of the whole region changed with it. In the war against the horde, it fell to the orcs, who raised an outpost amid its ruins and used it to raid the farmlands and stage their armies. The alliance struck back from the island fortress of Tol Barad, warriors out of Stromgard laying siege until the orcs were driven south toward Dun Algaz, and then the orcs counterattacked and took it once more, and even carried the fight back across the water. The town was not a prize for its own sake. It was a hand upon the road's throat, and whoever's hand it was could choke or free the entire marsh. Long after that war ended, when the soldiers of Ironforge had marched away to fight in far countries, and the dwarven heartland was left thin of defenders, the road suffered its cruelest betrayal, and it came from within the dwarven family itself. The Dark Iron Clan, that bitter remnant of the old civil war, came against the span under a warlock named Balgarus the Foul, with a scheme laid alongside another of their captains. They fell upon the bridges, and one of the two great arches was all but thrown down into the sea. What the orcs in all their fury had failed to destroy, kinsmen succeeded in breaking. I have read the accounts of the defenders who held the last remaining arch, and they are not grand. They are the small, exhausted records of soldiers far from help. Good dwarves died upon those stones with no reinforcements in sight. One sent to scout the broken eastern bridge and never seen alive again. His name read later off the helmet on his corpse. A brother fallen, comrades buried in the mud beside the work their people had labored generations to raise. In the end, the attackers were driven off, the warlock slain, the road reclaimed for the time being. But sit with what nearly happened there. A bridge built to mend a sundered people was almost destroyed by the unhealed half of that very sundering. The road that had once been forgiveness made solid became, for a moment, the place where the oldest dwarven grief tried to finish its work. To hold a road is not only to defend it against strangers. Sometimes it is to defend it against your own history. And so we come east, to the mountain, and to the heart of why this drowned and trampled country deserves to be remembered rather than merely crossed. For where the eastern edge of the old wetlands climbed away toward the highlands, there stood a fortress whose story turns the entire meaning of this place inside out. Its name is Grim Batol, and it is the proof of the marsh's terrible secret, that a passage in the wrong hands can become a prison. Grim Batol was not built by orcs or by any dark power. It was built by dwarves and built in hope. After the Civil War split their people, the Wildhammer clan, defeated and unwilling to dwell any longer beneath the mountain that had cast them out, marched north through the gate of Dun Algaz, that same southern door of the marsh, and raised for themselves a new kingdom in the great mountain beyond. The chronicles that survive describe Grim Batol in its glory as rivaling Ironforge itself, a wonder of dwarven craft hewn into the living rock. It was meant to be a fresh beginning, a home untainted by the bitterness that had driven them out. For a brief while, it was exactly that. The bitterness, however, was not finished with them. The Dark Irons, who had lost the same war and taken it far harder, struck out from their own new city in a two-pronged assault, falling upon the Bronzebeards in Ironforge and the Wildhammers in Grim Batol at once. The attack on the mountain was led by the sorceress queen of the Dark Irons, Modgud, and the fighting within those halls was savage beyond the telling. Shadows called up out of the very earth to hunt the defenders through their own corridors. The Wildhammer Thane cut her down at last, and her people were crushed between the Wildhammer defenders and a Bronzebeard army arrived to relieve them. By any reckoning of arms, it was a victory. But she did not die quietly, and her dying did not end with her death. The accounts agree that Modgud's fall left a curse soaked into the stone of Grim Batol, a taint that no scrubbing or prayer could lift. When the Wildhammers, their war finally won, came home to the fortress they had carved with such hope, they found it changed, uninhabitable, wrong, heavy, with something that watched. They would not live there. They turned their backs on the greatest work their hands had ever made and went away to found a new home in the high country to the north, and never returned. Think on that. A people built a kingdom to escape their grief, and their grief followed them into the stone and made the kingdom unlivable. We might call it the first prison of Grim Batol, a prison of memory, one that needed no jailer at all. An empty fortress in a forgotten land is a temptation, and history did not leave it forgotten for long. In the Great War against the Horde, an orcish warlock of the Dragonmaw clan, Necro Skullcrusher, came into possession of one of the most dreadful artifacts ever forged upon Azeroth, the Demon Soul, made in ages past by the corrupted Aspect who would become Deathwing, holding within it stolen power enough to bind even dragons. With it, the orc did the unthinkable. He captured Alexstrasza, the great red dragon Aspect, the Lifebinder herself, and dragged her in chains into the abandoned halls of Grim Batol. And the cursed mountain became a prison once again, but this time a prison with a living, suffering soul at its center. What was done there is among the darkest things the records preserve, and I will not dwell on it longer than truth requires. The Dragon Queen, bound by the demon soul and shackled with chains of dark iron make, was held captive in that mountain and forced to bear clutch after clutch of her own children, so that the Horde might break them to harness and ride them to war. The most generous power in the world, the very embodiment of life, was made into a brood engine for an army of conquest. Consider how perfectly cruel the geography of it was. Grim Batol could only be reached and resupplied through the marsh below, through the same passes the Wildhammers had once walked in hope. The road that had carried a people toward a new beginning now carried jailers to and from the cage of a goddess. A passage had become a prison, and the marsh had become the prison's only corridor. The deliverance, when it came from an unlikely few. A reckless young mage of the Kirin Tor named Ronan, and I confess a particular fondness for the tale, for it was the order of my own youth that kept its memory, gathered to himself a small and improbable company, a high elf ranger of the Windrunner line, a Wildhammer griffin rider whose own people had built the cursed mountain, and a red dragon walking in the shape of a mage who loved the captive queen. With the aid of dwarven resistance hidden in those very hills, they struck at the heart of the orc's power and destroyed the demon soul, and the stolen might within it returned at last to the aspects it had been wrung from. The accounts of that hour are tangled as the accounts of any rout tend to be, but they agree on the shape of it. Deathwing himself fell upon the dragon maw, hungering for the dragon queen's eggs, and slaughtered the orcs he no longer needed. Freed of her chains, Alexstrasza turned upon her captor and devoured him, and then turned, with her re-empowered kin, upon the great destroyer himself, who fled with what eggs he could seize. The red dragonflight remained behind to keep the desolate halls, and for a long while no living thing dared approach them. There is a detail I cannot let pass, for it is the whole grim moral of the mountain in a single line. The dwarves who came to that battle sensed, even in the hour of victory, that the darkness had not truly left the stone, and so they too departed, as the Wildhammers had departed before them, leaving the fortress sealed and shunned. Twice now a people had won grim Batol, and twice they had walked away, because some places, once made into prisons, never again become homes. When the world later broke apart in the great cataclysm, and the land itself was reshaped, grim Batol was carried out of the marsh entirely, lifted into the highlands beyond, and a darker cult claimed it still. The mountain refuses to this day to be at peace. It is the marsh's deepest warning, written large in cursed stone. A road can be sealed at both ends until it is no longer a passage at all, but a tomb with something still alive inside it. Set that horror against the harbor in the west, and you will see the two faces of the same truth gazing at each other across the marsh. For if grim Batol is the passage that became a prison, then Menethil Harbor is the passage that stayed faithful to what a passage is meant to be, a door that opens outward toward the world. It is, on its face, an unlovely place, a rough port on a small island, full of sailors and travelers and smugglers, and worse, lashed by the same gray rain that drowns the rest of the marsh, defended by a garrison forever bracing against orcs from the hills and murlocs from the tide. And yet I have always found a quiet dignity in it that the grander cities of Azeroth lack, for Menethil never pretended to be anything but what it was. It existed to let people leave. It was the marsh's promise kept, that whatever hunted you across the water, there was a key at the end of it, and a ship that would carry you somewhere better. There is a bitter irony folded into its history that the casual traveler never learns. The very ground on which the Alliance raised that harbor had first been chosen long before by the orc war chief Orgrim Doomhammer as the place to build the fleet of his invasion. The same shore was meant, in one age, to launch a conquest, and in the next, to offer refuge. Geography is loyal to no one. A coastline is only ever a coastline. Whether it becomes a launching place for war or a haven for the fleeing depends entirely on whose hands hold it and what those hands intend. The dwarves and humans who named the harbor for a king of Lordaeron understood, I think, that they were not merely building a town. They were deciding what that piece of the world would mean. And when at last the world broke and the waters rose, it was Menethil that took the brunt of the sea. The tides came surging in over its quays, and the low harbor flooded until its people waded through their own streets, piling sandbags, repairing, refusing to abandon the only safe door in all that drowned country. Inland, to the south, the great dam that had long held back the loch gave way as well, and its ruin sent fresh floods sprawling across the marsh. But the harbor's grief came straight off the ocean. It is a humble image, and I find it more moving than any siege of golden walls. A knot of stubborn folk standing waist-deep in cold water to keep a doorway open because they understood, perhaps better than the kings who never came there, that the door mattered more than the comfort of the room. For the marsh between these places was never gentle to those who tried to hold it, and it is worth remembering the smaller war that goes on there always, beneath the great wars of clans and dragons. The Wetlands fights back. Murlocs swarm up out of the shallows. Gnolls den in the high ground. Raptors hunt the open flats. Great crocolisks lie like sodden logs until they move. The mist swallows the road, and the rain rots the timber of every stronghold raised there until the ruined dwarven keeps thrust up out of the muck, like the bones of ambitions the land has already digested. This is the truth that gives the whole place its weight. The marsh is not a neutral stage on which history happens. It is an active thing, patient and hungry, forever working to pull the road back down into the water. Every season the road stays open is a season someone fought to keep it so. I know this not only from the chronicles, but from my own years, for I walked that country with the Explorers League, and I have stood at the digs that lie inland from the harbor, where my fellows scraped the mud from the relics of the dead. I remember the particular cold of the camp at evening, the way the fire never quite dried you, and the marsh sounds pressed close at the edge of the light, and the strange comfort of working at a patient task in a place so plainly indifferent to whether you lived or died. We came to read the bones of the land, old stones and older inscriptions, worked carvings hauled out of the silt that predate every war I have named. From relics that old, it is fair to suppose the marsh held some meaning of its own long before it became a thoroughfare for armies. What that meaning was, the silt has been less willing to surrender. Even the explorers, who came only to learn, had to be guarded, had to keep their own small road back to the harbor open. There is no such thing in the wetlands as merely passing through. The marsh charges a toll on everyone, and the toll is vigilance. So let me gather the threads, for they all run to the same knot. A southern gate that is the back of a wall, a northern bridge built out of forgiveness and nearly broken by an old grudge, an eastern mountain where a road of hope curdled into a prison for a goddess, a western harbor that kept faith with the simple promise of an open door, 4 thresholds and a hungry marsh between them, and over all of it the gray rain falling. The wetlands gave Azeroth no dynasty and no legend of its own making. What it gave was something harder to see and, I have come to think, harder to value rightly. It gave the South its connections. It was the joint that held the body together, the throat through which a whole region breathed. We do not, as a rule, honor such places. We raise our monuments to the rooms, not to the doorways, to the kings, not to the roads they rode away upon. We call a country great for what it holds, and pity a country that exists only to let others pass. And here at last the question I set before you turns over in the hand and shows its other side. I asked what a place is worth, when its only value is the ability to leave it. I have come to believe the question was wrong from the start, that it carried a hidden contempt I no longer share. For what is the ability to leave if not the ability to reach one another? A road is not a lesser thing than a fortress. A fortress is where a people hides from the world. A road is where a people meets it. The wetlands was never empty. It was full of everything in motion between places that mattered, full of the trade that fed the friendship of sundered clans, full of the ships that carried the fleeing toward safety, and yes, full also of the dark proof of what happens when a passage is sealed at both ends and turned against its purpose. To keep a road open is to insist that the distance between people need not harden into a wall. That is not a small thing to give a world. It may be the largest thing of all. The marsh is still there, of course, gray and patient, and crossed by travelers who will not remember it. The rain still falls on the broken arch of the bridge, and on the drowned streets of the harbor, and on the cursed flank of the mountain in the east. And in the south, the 1,000 stone steps still climb out of the mire toward the cold throat of the pass, worn smooth by all the feet that ever rose along them toward somewhere better. I think of those steps often, a place whose whole greatness was to carry others onward and ask nothing for itself, but that it be allowed to remain a road. Perhaps that is worth more than a kingdom. Perhaps, in the end, it is the only thing a kingdom is truly for.
Thank you.